Picture this. It's 1906. The rooftop garden of Madison Square Garden glitters under electric lights, a marvel of the modern age. The cream of New York society sips champagne, draped in diamonds and silk. The orchestra plays. Laughter fills the warm summer air. And then, bang. A single gunshot silences everything. A man falls. Blood pools across the pristine white tablecloth. And standing over him, pistol still smoking, is one of the richest men in America. Welcome to the Gilded Age. Blood, money, and murder. The dark secrets of America's Gilded Age. Before we dive into the blood-soaked scandals that define this era, you need to understand something. The Gilded Age wasn't just a time period. It was a powder keg waiting to explode. The term Gilded Age was coined by Mark Twain himself in 1873. And here's the thing, he didn't mean it as a compliment. Gilded means covered in a thin layer of gold, beautiful on the outside, rotten underneath. From roughly 1870 to 1900, America underwent the most dramatic transformation in its history. Railroads stretched across the continent like iron veins. Cities exploded upward with skyscrapers that scraped the heavens. Fortunes were made overnight, fortunes so vast they would make today's billionaires blush. We're talking about men like John D. Rockefeller, whose Standard Oil controlled 90% of America's oil refineries. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who built a railroad empire worth over $100 million. That's roughly $3 billion in today's money. Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, Jay Gould. These men didn't just have money, they had America. But here's what the history books often skip over. Where there's that much power, that much wealth, that much ambition, there's also that much darkness. Jealousy, betrayal, obsession, revenge. And murder. Beat. Over the next hour, we're going to pull back the golden curtain and expose 4 shocking murders that rocked the Gilded Age to its core. These aren't just historical footnotes. They're stories of passion, corruption, madness, and the terrifying truth about what happens when power goes unchecked. 2 presidents, 1 legendary architect, 1 robber baron. All dead, all killed in scandals that expose the rotting heart of America's golden age. Let's begin. January 6th, 1872. The Grand Central Hotel, New York City. A heavyset man with a flamboyant mustache and an even more flamboyant personality climbs the grand staircase. He's wearing his signature style, military-style coat dripping with gold braid, diamond stickpin glittering in his cravat. He looks like a peacock. A very rich, very powerful peacock. This is James Fisk, Jr. They called him Jubilee Jim. They called him the Prince of Erie. They called him a lot of things, actually, most of them unprintable. At 37 years old, Jim Fisk was one of the most notorious men in America. And in about 30 seconds, he was going to be dead. Gunshot sound effect. Let me tell you how we got here. Jim Fisk's story reads like something out of a novel, the kind your grandmother would hide under her mattress. Born in 1835 in Vermont, Fisk was the son of a peddler. He started out selling goods from a cart, learned the art of the hustle, and discovered he had a gift, not for honest work, for manipulation. During the Civil War, Fisk made his first fortune smuggling cotton from the Confederate South, technically illegal, definitely immoral, and incredibly profitable. But that was just the appetizer. After the war, Fisk teamed up with 2 of the most ruthless financiers in American history, Jay Gould and Daniel Drew. Together, they took control of the Erie Railroad through a scheme so corrupt, so brazen, it became known as the Erie War. Here's the short version. They literally printed fake stock certificates, millions of dollars worth, and flooded the market with them. When Cornelius Vanderbilt tried to buy up Erie stock to gain control, Fisk and his partners just made more. They ran printing presses through the night, churning out worthless paper while Vanderbilt hemorrhaged money trying to buy a company that kept getting bigger on paper. It was fraud on a scale America had never seen, and Jim Fisk walked away with millions. But Fisk wasn't content with just being rich. He wanted to be famous. He bought an opera house. He installed himself as admiral of a steamship line, complete with a custom naval uniform covered in gold braid. He threw parties that would make Gatsby weep with envy. He lived large, loud, and completely without shame. And then there was Josie. Music shifts to something more romantic, then sinister. Josie Mansfield was a 23-year-old actress when Fisk first laid eyes on her. Dark hair, pale skin, and the kind of beauty that started wars. Fisk was instantly obsessed. Here's the problem. Jim Fisk was already married. Did that stop him? Not even a little bit. Fisk set Josie up in a lavish brownstone just steps from his own mansion. He showered her with jewels, clothes, anything she wanted. He essentially created a parallel life with Josie as his unofficial queen. But Josie was ambitious, and Josie was smart, and Josie had her eyes on someone else. Edward Styles Stokes was everything Jim Fisk was not. Where Fisk was loud and flashy, Stokes was refined and handsome. Where Fisk came from nothing, Stokes came from old money. He was Josie's type, sophisticated, elegant, and young. And he was already in business with Fisk, which made the betrayal even sweeter. By 1870, Josie and Ned Stokes were having an affair right under Fisk's nose. When Fisk finally found out, the fallout was spectacular. Lawsuits flew. Accusations were made public. Josie claimed Fisk had promised her money and property. Fisk claimed she was an extortionist. Stokes claimed Fisk had cheated him in business. Fisk claimed Stokes was a conniving snake. The newspapers couldn't get enough. Every scandalous detail was printed. Every accusation was debated in parlors across the nation. It was the reality television of its day, a love triangle involving a corrupt railroad baron, a beautiful actress, and a jealous rival. But Ned Stokes wasn't satisfied with winning Josie. He wanted to destroy Jim Fisk completely. Tension builds in the music. On January 6, 1872, Stokes learned that a grand jury had indicted him for blackmail, charges pushed by Fisk. His attempt to extort money from Fisk using incriminating letters had backfired. He was facing prison. Something snapped. Stokes grabbed a pistol and went to the Grand Central Hotel, where he knew Fisk would be arriving for a meeting. He waited on the staircase. When Fisk appeared, Stokes didn't hesitate. 2 shots, one to the arm, one to the abdomen. Jim Fisk, the Prince of Erie, the man who had manipulated markets and mocked the law, collapsed on the staircase. He lingered through the night, conscious enough to identify his killer. "It was Stokes," he gasped. By morning, he was dead. Beat. The trial that followed was a circus. Stokes was convicted of first-degree murder, but his lawyers appealed and appealed again. The case went through 3 trials. In the end, he served just 4 years for manslaughter. 4 years, for killing one of the most famous men in America. But here's the dark irony nobody talks about. Jim Fisk's funeral drew over 20,000 mourners. The same newspapers that had mocked him weeks earlier now praised him as a man of the people. His financial crimes were forgotten. His corruption was overlooked. In death, Jubilee Jim became a folk hero. Because in the Gilded Age, the rules were simple. If you were rich enough, famous enough, powerful enough, you could get away with almost anything. Almost, July 2nd, 1881. The Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station, Washington, D.C. President James A. Garfield walks through the station, in good spirits. He's on his way to his college reunion at Williams College, looking forward to a rare break from the chaos of politics. He's been president for only 4 months. 4 months of dealing with a Republican Party torn apart by internal warfare. 4 months of job seekers lining up at the White House, demanding positions, appointments, favors. As Garfield crosses the waiting room, a man steps out of the shadows. He's small, bearded, with wild eyes that speak of obsession. "I am a stalwart of the stalwarts," the man screams. "Arthur is president now." And he fires 2 shots into the president's back. Gunshot effects. This is the assassination of James A. Garfield. And it's one of the most tragic, most preventable, and most bizarre killings in American history. To understand why Garfield died, you need to understand one thing: the spoils system. In 1881, there was no professional civil service. When a new president took office, everything changed. Thousands of government jobs, from postmasters to customs officials to clerks, were handed out as rewards to political supporters. If you campaigned for the winning candidate, if you donated money, if you knew the right people, you got a job. This created a nightmare. Presidents spent most of their time not governing, but dealing with an endless parade of job seekers. Lincoln complained about it. Grant complained about it. Every president complained about it. And it attracted the desperate, the delusional, the dangerous. Enter Charles Julius Guido. Music takes an unsettling turn. Guido was, to put it bluntly, disturbed. He had failed at everything he ever tried. He'd been a lawyer who rarely won cases, a theologian who got kicked out of a religious commune, a journalist whose newspapers nobody read, a husband who beat his wife. But Guido believed, truly, deeply believed, that he was destined for greatness. In 1880, Guido decided his destiny was in politics. He wrote a campaign speech supporting Garfield, a speech he delivered maybe once or twice to small audiences. But in his mind, this speech was the reason Garfield won the election. Guido convinced himself that he had personally delivered victory to the Republicans. And now it was time for his reward. After Garfield's inauguration, Guido began haunting the White House and State Department, demanding an appointment. He wanted to be consul to Paris, then Vienna, then anything, really. He just wanted what he believed he was owed. He wasn't alone. Hundreds of job seekers lined up daily, pushing petitions at anyone who would listen. But Guido was different. Guido was persistent. Guido was unhinged. When Secretary of State James Blaine finally told him to never come back, something shifted in Guido's fractured mind. God, he decided, had given him a new mission. Be it. For weeks, Guido stalked the president. He followed Garfield to church. He watched him leave the White House. He waited for the perfect moment. He even borrowed money to buy a pistol, choosing a model with an ivory handle because he thought it would look better in a museum display. Yes, he literally planned for his weapon to become a historical artifact. On that July morning, Guido finally found his moment. As Garfield walked arm in arm with Secretary Blaine through the train station, Guido approached from behind and fired twice. The first bullet grazed Garfield's arm. The second lodged somewhere in his back. Garfield fell. "My God, what is this?" he gasped. Guido was immediately seized by a stunned crowd. As police dragged him away, he shouted that he had done it for the good of the Republican Party. Chester Arthur, the vice president, a member of the rival stalwart faction, was now president. Everything would be better now. In Guido's mind, he was a hero. Music becomes sorrowful. But here's where the tragedy deepens. The bullet that hit Garfield's back was not immediately fatal. Doctors weren't sure where it had lodged. And in 1881, the concept of antiseptic surgery was still not widely accepted in America. What followed was 11 weeks of medical torture. Doctor after doctor probed the wound with unwashed fingers and unsterilized instruments, searching for the bullet. Alexander Graham Bell even brought an early metal detector to try to locate it. Nothing worked. Meanwhile, infection spread. Garfield, who had been a strong, healthy 49-year-old, wasted away. He lost over 80 pounds. Abscesses formed throughout his body. His heart weakened. On September 19, 1881, James A. Garfield finally died, not from the bullet itself, but from the infections caused by his doctor's attempts to save him. Modern physicians believe that if Garfield had been left alone, if doctors had simply cleaned and dressed the wound, he likely would have survived. Charles Guido was tried, and despite his lawyer's attempts to plead insanity, was found guilty and sentenced to death. He went to the gallows on June 30th, 1882, still believing he had done the right thing. Before the trapdoor opened, he recited a poem he had written for the occasion. The man was insane, but the system that created him, the spoils system that turned government jobs into prizes to be fought over, was the true killer. Garfield's death finally shocked Congress into action. In 1883, the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act was passed, beginning the slow transformation of American government into a professional bureaucracy. It took a president's death to change things. It always does. 20 years pass. It's September 6, 1901. The Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, is in full swing, a celebration of progress, technology, and American power. Electric lights illuminate the grounds. The newly invented X-ray machine amazes visitors. Everything points toward a bright, modern future. President William McKinley is there to enjoy it. He's at the height of his popularity. He's just won re-election in a landslide. The economy is booming. America has become an imperial power, with new territories stretching from Puerto Rico to the Philippines. McKinley works the crowd, shaking hands, smiling warmly. He genuinely enjoys meeting regular Americans. His security is worried. There have been anarchist attacks across Europe, and just last year the King of Italy was assassinated, but McKinley waves off their concerns. "No one would wish to hurt me," he says. He's wrong. In line at the Temple of Music, waiting patiently, is a 28-year-old man named Leon C. Zalgas. His right hand is wrapped in a white bandage. At least, that's what it looks like. Under the bandage is a .32 caliber revolver. As C. Zalgas reaches the president and extends his left hand to shake, McKinley reaches out warmly. And C. Zalgas fires twice through the bandage. Gunshot effects. McKinley staggers back, clutching his stomach. Blood spreads across his white vest. As guards tackle C. Zalgas and begin beating him, McKinley, even now, even dying, calls out, "Don't let them hurt him." That was the kind of man William McKinley was. Somber pause. Leon C. Zalgas was not insane like Guido. He wasn't motivated by personal grievance like Stokes. C. Zalgas was an anarchist, a true believer in a radical political philosophy that sought to destroy all government, all hierarchy, all structured power. Born in Detroit to Polish immigrant parents, C. Zalgas had worked in factories since childhood. He saw the brutal conditions workers endured, the 14-hour days, the dangerous machinery, the poverty wages. He watched the rich grow richer while his family struggled. Anarchist literature gave him answers. The problem wasn't just bad bosses or corrupt politicians. The problem was the entire system, and the solution was to tear it all down. When C. Zalgas heard the anarchist speaker, Emma Goldman, describe how the oppressed must resist their oppressors, something clicked. He decided he would strike a blow against the system by killing its most visible symbol, the President of the United States. There was no conspiracy, no grand plan, just one angry young man with a gun. Music shifts. The doctors who treated McKinley were more skilled than those who had butchered Garfield. They cleaned the wounds, found and removed one bullet, and closed him up. For several days, it seemed McKinley might recover. Newspapers reported optimistic updates. The nation breathed a sigh of relief. But gangrene was spreading, invisible, inside the president's body. By September 13th, McKinley knew he was dying. "It is useless, gentlemen," he told his doctors. "I think we ought to have prayer." He died early on September 14th, 1901. His last words, reportedly, were the opening lines of his favorite hymn, "Nearer, my God, to thee." Theodore Roosevelt, who had been hiking in the Adirondacks when word came, rushed back to Buffalo. At 42 years old, he became the youngest president in American history. And Leon C. Zalgas. He was tried, convicted, and executed by electric chair just 45 days after the shooting, one of the fastest trials and executions in American history. He showed no remorse. "I killed the president because he was the enemy of the good people, the good working people," C. Zalgas said. "I am not sorry for my crime." After his execution, prison officials poured sulfuric acid into his coffin to destroy his remains. afraid his grave might become a shrine for anarchists. McKinley's assassination marked the end of an era. The optimism of the Gilded Age, the belief that progress would solve all problems, that America's future was endless prosperity, died with him. What came next was different. Roosevelt's presidency ushered in the progressive era, with its trust-busting, its labor reforms, its recognition that something had gone terribly wrong in American society. But it took another dead president to get there. We began this story on a rooftop in Manhattan. It's time to return there. June 25, 1906. Madison Square Garden, the most famous entertainment venue in America. The building itself was a Stanford White creation. He had designed it, this magnificent palace of pleasure with its rooftop garden and its tower topped by a controversial nude statue of the goddess Diana. White didn't just design buildings, he designed dreams. Stanford White was, without question, the most celebrated architect in America. His firm, McKim, Mead & White, had designed the Boston Public Library, the Washington Square Arch, the original Pennsylvania Station. If you wanted the best, if you wanted beauty, if you wanted your wealth transformed into permanent monuments of taste and sophistication, you hired Stanford White. But Stanford White had secrets. Music darkens. White was 52 years old, married with a son, respected by society. He was also a sexual predator who used his fame, his wealth, and his connections to prey on young women. The most famous of his victims was a girl named Evelyn Nesbit. Evelyn was just 16 when she first entered Stanford White's orbit in 1901. She was stunningly beautiful. Artists called her the most beautiful woman in America, and she was working as an artist's model and chorus girl to support her impoverished family. White seduced her. The details, as Evelyn later revealed them, were horrifying. He plied her with champagne. He took her to a mirrored room in his private studio. What happened there was, by any modern definition, rape. But in 1901, there was no word for what White did. There were no laws that protected girls like Evelyn. There was only power, and Stanford White had all of it. For a time, Evelyn was White's plaything. He showered her with gifts, paid for her education, introduced her to society. But eventually, as always happened, he grew bored. He moved on to the next young girl, and Evelyn was left with nothing but trauma and a reputation. Enter Harry Kendall Thaw. Music becomes unsettling. If Stanford White represented the cultured excess of the Gilded Age, Harry Thaw represented its madness. Thaw was the son of a Pittsburgh railroad and coal baron worth $40 million. He had never worked a day in his life. He had never needed to. From childhood, Harry Thaw had been violent, erratic, and obsessive. He threw tantrums that lasted for days. He was expelled from multiple schools. He assaulted people with little provocation. His family's money kept him out of prison again and again. When Thaw met Evelyn Nesbit in 1903, he became instantly, pathologically obsessed. He pursued her across continents. He showered her with proposals. And eventually, whether out of exhaustion or calculation, Evelyn agreed to marry him. But there was a condition. Thaw insisted. Evelyn had to tell him everything about Stanford White. What Evelyn told him, the seduction, the mirrored room, all of it, drove Thaw into a jealous frenzy that never quite cooled. He called White the Beast. He ranted about him constantly. He hired private detectives to follow White. He dreamed of revenge. Evelyn would later admit that she exaggerated parts of her story, perhaps even invented details, to feed Thaw's obsession. She may have manipulated him deliberately, or she may simply have been trapped in a nightmare of her own making, an abused girl who had escaped one monster only to marry another. Tension builds. On the night of June 25, 1906, Harry and Evelyn Thaw attended the opening of a new musical, Mamselle Champagne, at Madison Square Garden's rooftop theater. Stanford White was there too, sitting alone at a table near the stage. Thaw couldn't take his eyes off him. During the finale, as the performers sang, "I Could Love a Million Girls," Thaw stood up, walked calmly across the rooftop garden, and stopped in front of Stanford White. He pulled out a pistol. 3 shots, point blank, into Stanford White's face. The architect who had designed the building died amid his own creation, blood pooling across the white tablecloth, the song still playing in the background. Thaw raised the pistol over his head, showing the crowd it was empty. "He deserved it," Thaw reportedly said. "He ruined my wife." The audience, initially thinking it was part of the show, slowly realized what had happened. Screams filled the night air, and Harry Kendall Thaw stood there, waiting calmly for the police. Beat. What followed was called the Trial of the Century, and it earned the title. Thaw's defense was simple. He had been driven temporarily insane by the knowledge of what White had done to his wife. It wasn't murder. It was dementia Americana, a term invented specifically for this trial, suggesting that any red-blooded American man would be driven mad by learning his wife had been violated. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The second trial found Thaw not guilty by reason of insanity. He was committed to a state mental hospital for the criminally insane. But Harry Thaw's money bought him freedom there too. In 1913, he escaped to Canada, was extradited, and eventually, incredibly, was declared sane and released in 1915. He would later be arrested for kidnapping and assaulting a teenage boy. He would spend more time in mental institutions. He would never face real consequences for his crimes. And Evelyn Nesbit. She divorced Thaw, struggled with poverty and addiction, attempted suicide multiple times, and spent decades trying to escape the scandal that defined her life. She died in 1967 in a nursing home, largely forgotten. The crime of the century had no winners, only victims and the vultures who profited from their suffering. So what do these 4 murders tell us about the Gilded Age? Look at the killers. Edward Stokes, who killed Jim Fisk, was a wealthy man driven by jealousy, greed, and wounded pride. He served 4 years and went on to live a comfortable life. Charles Guidow, who killed President Garfield, was a delusional failure who believed the system owed him rewards he hadn't earned. He was a product of a corrupt political machine that treated government jobs as prizes. Leon Czolgosz, who killed President McKinley, was a working-class man who looked at the vast inequality of his time and saw no path forward except violence. He was executed so quickly, the system barely had to reckon with his message. Harry Thaw, who killed Stanford White, was a mentally unstable heir whose family's money shielded him from every consequence until he committed murder on a rooftop in front of hundreds of witnesses. Even then, he walked free. Now look at the victims. Jim Fisk was a corrupt robber baron who had defrauded millions. James Garfield was an honest man trying to reform a broken system. William McKinley was a beloved president who genuinely cared about ordinary Americans. Stanford White was a genius architect who was also a predator of young women. Good men and bad men, killed for reasons ranging from political ideology to sexual jealousy to sheer madness. But the common thread, the thing that connects all of these stories, is this. In the Gilded Age, there were no rules for the powerful. The rich could manipulate markets, seduce teenage girls, buy elections, and walk away from consequences that would have destroyed ordinary people. The system protected them. The law served them. The newspapers both exposed and celebrated them. And when violence finally came, as it always does when inequality grows too vast, when injustice becomes too blatant, when the gap between the powerful and the powerless becomes a chasm, nobody should have been surprised. The Gilded Age was not a golden era. It was a warning. Beat. We look at these stories as history, as entertainment, as scandals from another time. But ask yourself this. When we live in an age of unprecedented wealth inequality, when billionaires build private space programs while workers can't afford health care, when political violence is rising, when institutions are distrusted, when anger simmers just below the surface of American life. Are we really that different from 1881, from 1901, from 1906? The Gilded Age ended not because the problems were solved, but because they became impossible to ignore. It took assassinated presidents and public scandals and decades of struggle before things began to change. What will it take this time? The bodies are long buried now. Jim Fisk lies in a grand mausoleum in Vermont, mourned as a folk hero despite his crimes. James Garfield rests in a magnificent memorial in Cleveland, a martyr to a corrupt system. William McKinley's tomb in Canton, Ohio, draws visitors who remember a kind man taken too soon. Stanford White has a quiet grave, his legacy complicated by truths that couldn't stay hidden. And their killers. Edward Stokes died wealthy, respectable, his crime largely forgotten. Charles Guidow's name lives on only in textbooks about political violence. Leon C. Zalgas was erased, deliberately, chemically, as if history itself wanted to pretend he never existed. Harry Thaw died in 1947, still rich, still protected, still unpunished. The Gilded Age lasted roughly 30 years. Its scandals, its murders, its extremes of wealth and poverty shaped the America we still live in today. The mansions are museums now. The robber barons are names on university buildings. The victims are statues and portraits and chapters in history books. But the questions they raise, about power, about justice, about what we're willing to tolerate from the rich and famous, those questions never went away. They're still waiting for answers. Final music sting. End card. Narrator, VO. If this documentary taught you something, hit that subscribe button. The algorithm decides what stories get told, and stories like these deserve to be heard. Next time, we're diving into another dark chapter of American history. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember, history isn't just the past. It's a mirror, researched and written with historical accuracy. Based on documented events from 1870 to 1906.